Moritz. I am the current director of the Center for Humanities Research. It's my privilege to introduce Lwando, who will then in turn introduce Hugo. So this is like a cascading, it's a waterfall of introductions. Lwando Scott holds a PhD in sociology, of all things. And is a senior researcher in the Center for Humanities Research. He's one of two new full-time appointments in the center. He was appointed towards the end of last year, and Lindawa Dalamba was appointed at the beginning of this year to kind of round out the complement of researchers in the center. We're very excited to have you guys on board, properly, so to speak. Before that, he was a next-generation researcher in the center. So he's an interdisciplinary scholar with a focus on gender and sexualities, on how these categories must be linked to ideas of freedom in post-apartheid South Africa. His scholarship is engaged with the complex ways gender and sexuality feature in post-colonial scholarship. Working with the concept of queering the post-colony, Lwando has published on the intersections of sexuality, gender, and African cultural practices in post-apartheid South Africa. He's interested in expansive ideas and practices of freedom that go beyond normative nationalist and racialized boundaries. Lwando's work echoes the call issued by Famida Riaz in her epic poem, "Come, Let Us Create a New Lexicon." Lwando.
Thank you, Morris. Welcome, everyone, to the CHR again on this really, really special occasion to celebrate 30 years of women's and gender studies. What a thing to be here with you all today to mark this moment. And of course, also welcome to our rewiring exhibition, And I, a Newly Evolved Fish, with this fantastic, fantastic seminar. As been said, my name is Lwando Scott, and I'm a researcher here, and I have the double pleasure of introducing our keynote, Professor Hugo Ka Canham, and then chairing the session through a brief response, and then handling of the call and response later. Hugo Ka Canham is a professor at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at UNISA. He foregrounds Black ways of knowing to think with multi-species life forms, the phenomenology of queer things, and the texture of living at the margins of human value, suffering, and death. He understands this under the rubric of Black planetary studies. His book, Riotous Deathscapes, published in 2003, was published by Duke University Press. It is available here in South Africa through Wits University Press, which I believe is the former home institution for Professor Canham. His book, Riotous Deathscapes, was awarded the Academy of Sciences of South Africa Humanities Book Prize for 2025. His forthcoming book, if that wasn't enough, Black Undertow, is under contract with Duke University Press as we speak, and we look forward to that publication when it arrives. No pressure. Welcome back to the CHR, Hugo. We look forward to hear your watery interventions. The podium is yours for now.
Thank you very much, and congratulations. Happy birthday to Women's and Gender Studies. Thank you for having us here at the CHR. So I'm going to talk about, as the program says, enchantments and opacities of water. In a multi-species world, and I'm going to read, you'll forgive me, a learning disorder from earlier. In a multi-species world, we live entangled lives that make and unmake us in ways that defy the enclosures and stasis of the chain of being and the associated gendered and sexual categories that characterize the Anthropocene. To be enmeshed with our surroundings remakes us and disrupts the borders of the human and those of other species too. Through passionate queer immersions, through passionate queer multi-species immersion, the artwork that features in the exhibition that we'll see later is an apt illustration of watery entanglements, not just to the human, but other things and species too. Thinking with Van Doren and Kirsty and Munster, they describe what they describe as the art of attentiveness. We are reminded that knowing and living are deeply entangled, and paying attention can and should be the basis for crafting better possibilities of shared life. Sakhel Solanke's beautiful artwork, which blends the human figure with water, is an example of this attentiveness to how we come into being. So I think it's the cover image here. So too is Michaela Peterson's work featuring Tracy Kwai dressed as the sea. I would say the same for Cherry Hugo's evocative images of bodies submerged in water. These images undo the human who can only breathe outside of water, and they shed the ascriptions to gender binaries. Bronwyn cuts Maaghout, or stomachhood, consisting of a mountain of the sea, copper wire, candle, and mild steel, is an amalgamation of shared life forms that surface thick contact zones of cultural and natural entanglements. Stone, as we know, is the portal to what Catherine Youssef theorizes as geological life, time before Eurocentric markings of temporality. As the description Mountain of the Sea suggests, the rock in the artwork are from the ocean. They have witnessed the comings and goings on this shoreline, trade in goods and persons, excess, extraction, shifting waterlines, time, and the detritus of capital. The rocks that constitute the sea mountain know the things we have evacuated from public memory. This exhibition is a queer surfacing, which is also to say it is a world where modernity has alienated us from other species. In a world where modernity has alienated us from other species, the exhibition is a strange surfacing. Some of the artwork that reflects on themes like forced removals and earlier histories of enslavement point to the fact that humans and other species are not entangled in the same ways. We are situated in different positionalities and degrees of exposure. We perform different kinds of labor, are required to take different risks, and have different ways of knowing and being in the world. In Doren, Kirsty, and Munster's words, histories of gender and race, of political economy and colonization are layered into the multi-species world. How can they not be, shaping possibilities as they do for everyone? Jody Brand's Pickle series in this exhibition is a wonderful representation of our different exposures and situatedness. In this series, we see pickles pressed into glass jars, possibly as a preserve, as sterilization, as embalming, as a reckoning with history that refuses to be disappeared. It recalls the preserved animal fetuses that lined the cabinets of my biology classroom in high school. The stickers on the jars do not describe different kinds of pickles like mangoes, apricots, achars, or even fetuses. Instead, in a disorienting plunge through time, we are taken to the slave ledgers that marked the names of the enslaved. As the stickers say, Van Mozambique, February, Maart, April, Adonis van de Kaap, Philip van de Kaap of Madagascar, Moses of the Cape, Sericus of Mauritius, Dam of Bengal, Peter of Madagascar, Sarah of the Cape, January van Mozambique, February van Mozambique. These names that were slapped onto their bewildered owners are geographical markers of possible places of origin before people were brought here. We see their echo in the slave lodge and in the memorial courtyard of the offices to Izigo Museum. The bottle, capped by a blue plastic and white tape, has a forensic quality with ominous undertows that allude to sedimented things that seep through time and perhaps betray their preserving liquids. Maybe there's a stench of something rotten here. The careful preserve of what is inside has betrayed its contents and now implicates things on the outside. The old seeps into the present. These jars echo Yvette Christians's 2006 novel, Unconfessed, where she fictively reconstructs the life of Scylla van der Kaap, a woman enslaved in the Cape and who killed one of her children to save them from further abuse on the slave plantation of the 1820s here in the Cape. I return to Scylla in a bit, and I will sit with Scylla. For now, I want to pause on questions of enchantment and opacity, to think gender and sexuality, perhaps dunk these concepts into enchanted water. One dimension of inhabiting the world with a planetary multi-species sensibility is to surface portals to other worlds, selves and forms of liquid fluidity enabled by enchantment and opacity. Sacred ecologies gain their salience through enchantment. Harry Garuba observes that Africans have long lived with enchantment through seeing the sacred and profane in the natural world, rivers, oceans, caves, trees, animals, rock, and other material forms. Enchantment works against atomization by pressing on relation and the ties that constitute the world. Murai Mayako and John Perham contend that enchantment does magic. It destabilizes boundaries between humans, animals, plants, and environments. It challenges the hierarchies that come with these boundaries. To this list, I add the destabilization of gender and sexuality, that we are not trapped in atomized bodies, desires, and forms of being. Modernity comes with disenchantment. Nature, when we are disenchanted, becomes insignificant or completely intelligible. When we become disenchanted and the natural world loses its meaning, disenchantment grants capitalism and other forms of instrumentalism a space in which to operate. This is an extractive space. Wonder is excavated, mind transformed into commodification, possession, profit, and ideology. We are fixed and closed in racial capitalist logics and modernist enclosures of gender and sexuality. Rory Tsepai has curated bodies and queer objects freed from the rigor mortis of colonial categories, liberated by water. Water is a potentially unfixing agent. It undoes us and flings us into relation with other things and species, illing things, reeds, seaweed, shells, rock, algae, sandy accretions, dead and living fish, kelp. In its violent jostle or languid lull, water queers us. In the water, we bob queerly. Water is an enchanted material. It works against hierarchies, transparency, and knowing. It flows against containment and stability. In the exhibition to be open later, Chris solves the expanse made of worn sandpaper through woodblock impressions, and Sabelo Mlange in his work are apt illustrations of water's insistence on opacity and multiplicity that emerges from a refusal of intelligibility. Water's very intelligibility and capacity to open worlds and evade modernity and capitalism's inclination to imprison makes it a powerful technology for undoing taxonomies of sexuality and gender. Payen and Hagen contend that African cultures characterize water by virtue of its life-giving nature as both physical and spiritual in essence. They emphasize greater spiritual utility than the physical. Water is used in important prayer forms and in various acts of libation. It is used in rituals such as purification, sacralization, reparation, and revitalization. and both for blessing and cursing. Water is used in social interactions and in making and breaking of social relationships. As in life, we cross many rivers to reach various destinations. Waters and bodies also play a role in rites of individual and collective transitions from the profane to the sacred. So hlangana emlanjeni. To enchant water to enchant water is to engender magic. We might enter the water freighted by gendered expectations, but submerged in its destabilizing depths, we wade, float, or streak in the direction of our desire. Where the settled ways of knowing of stable land are loosed and washed. As a space of diviners and healers, water opens portals to multiple elsewheres. It can be strange. We can be strange in water. Edward Glissant's Poetics of Relation points to the generativity and wonder of pursuing strange paths through our right to opacity. To surrender to partial knowing, which is also to refuse the transparency required by modernity. What are you, uyintoni? Perhaps even to destabilize the knowing that comes with categories such as lesbian, gay, and bisexual. Like water, to gurgle and gush with wonder in delight of pleasure without ceiling, base, or defined pathways. Observe how we break out of frameworks and systems that hem us in. Witness our fugitivity towards opacity, in search for freedom within particular surroundings. Fugitive or errant movements enable us to plunge into opacities to which we have access wherever we are access. To resist models of enclosure, alongside errantry, opacity underscores a queer multilingual lexicon. It is an embrace of the poetics of multiplicity, a queer relinquishing of truth, and renunciation of single pathways. For the survival of queer being, opacity must be preserved and nurtured. We cannot be known in our totality. For this reason, to be queer is to be constantly on the move, engaging in fugitive practices and evading the lenses of all-knowing disciplinary enclosures of science. By engaging in practices that embrace opacity, we refuse to be replicas of imperial substitutes. Instead of asking for room within the frameworks of modernity, I propose that the most generative space may be the verdant cross-currents where planetary multi-species beings rub in productive tension. Opacity requires errantry. To be errant is to aspire to watery movement over rootedness. It is to challenge the metropole as the universal and to work towards dissolving claims of universality. It follows the confluence of the oceanic currents and is never self-satisfied. It is rhizomatic since it does not attach to a single root, but to a large network of roots that defy single origins and destination. As queer, why come out of the closet when there is water? To emerge, submerge, and remake oneself in ways that embrace errantry and opacity, that one can be revised from who they said they were the day before. Thinking of opacity and the closet in the era of gay visibility, Nicholas de Villiers describes as now ubiquitous in a neoliberal era with new strategies wherein queer people are controlled less by homophobic exclusion than by politics of inclusion and legalization. Therefore, regulation, commercialization, ironically, privatization, queer opacity allows us to reconsider the generativity of not knowing, not being available to capital. Water as a metaphor and material is an important artistic illustration of the refusal of full knowing. Dressed in a two-piece bathing suit, Cupid might hide in plain sight alongside Daniel Morolang's black photographic subjects who also pose on the beach. Cupid is a citizen of the city, right? In Neo Motloga's art, which superimposes heads into figures in ways that destabilize ideas of origins and gender. Blended this way, these works refuse the categories of regulation. After all, de Villiers suggests that homophobia is an anxious insistence on knowing and demands transparency to the gaze and then to police the sexuality of gay people. To come out of the closet, David Halperin observes, is precisely to expose oneself to a different set of dangers and constraints, to make oneself into a convenient screen onto which straight people can project all their fantasies they regularly entertain about gay people, and to suffer one's very gesture, statement, and expression and opinion to be totally irrevocably marked by the overwhelming social significance of one's openly acknowledged homosexual identity, close quotes. To be queer in ways that defy expectation is to move like water, whose depths and movement and portals are never totally knowable and therefore ever open to wonder and possibility. I'm now going to move to Scylla, which is an excerpt of the forthcoming work that Luando referred to. And I want to think of Scylla van die Kaap. This is a figure that Yvette Christianse wrote about in a novel, Unconfessed. I want to think about this reading as a call and response to the work on the jars by Jody Brand. And now I return to Scylla van die Kaap, who should actually be Scylla van die Mozambique, because Yvette Christianse tells us that she arrived in the Cape from Mozambique. As a form of call and response in relation to the artworks of the exhibition, the archival record, and Christianse's novel Unconfessed, I read from this excerpt. In search... Oh. Thank you. Is it better?
There are seats in the front, two, three, four. It's a pity to.
Sure, so I will. It goes against my. In search of Scylla, which is also to be in pursuit of her mother, I returned to Mozambique. I walked the streets in the tradition of Saadia Hartman, who threaded the slave castle at Alima in Ghana, in her own quest to trace her pre-enslavement history. I examined the faces of the women. I wondered if the weariness etched in their faces was their fatigue after centuries of looking for their daughter, Scylla. How many Scyllas lost to the ships? I do not have an image of Scylla, and in my mind, her likeness moves like water. It dissolves as it forms, leaving only traces in the wake. It is these traces that I use in my search. Everyone is simultaneously Scylla's mother and not. On a balmy morning, a few paces from where others clad in white robes search the water, with the ghostly guide given by Christianse, I compare my traces to those in the water. I too am engaged in a queer water practice, beating the water and its motion away from me. 4, 8, and then multitudes of faces appear in the ripples. Before any of them register, in my mind they dissolve. At the fish market, those who've been to Maputo would know that expensive fish market for tourists. The women speak Shangaan. Is this the tongue that disappears into Scylla's mouth to be replaced by Afrikaans, learned on the Cape plantations? But perhaps in the early dawn, before she awakens to draw water for old Macy's on the farm, she dreams in those Shangaan tones of the fish market. Away from Maputo, in Nampula in the north, where granite mounds startle the otherwise undulating landscape, I feel closer to finding Scylla's mother. It is rural here. Perhaps I am feverish. Allow yourself to be infected too. Join me in my search for Scylla's mother. to be in a fever in another timescape is to surrender to a queer haunting. Avery Gordon tells us that haunting raises spectres and it alters the experience of being in linear time, the way we separate the past, the present, and the future. It is to rifle through slavery's time bind. We are in an altered state of mind, summoned by the need for witnessing. In this search, I follow others like Alexis, Pauline Gums, who lost themselves by letting go of their voices and surrendering to language practices outside of memory and education. To recognize Scylla's mother, I too must lose language practices that ground me to the limits of the human. When schoolgirls appear in the long shrubbery, instead of a mother, it is Scylla that I see make for freedom. This is a different outcome to her disappearance in the belly of the ship. In the hold, I contemplate telling her to remain hidden behind the baobab trees where no one will find her. But before I do, she comes into view. There are no slave catchers in sight, and like a ripple in the water, she vanishes once more. The car that I'm in is moving again. I see many more versions of Scylla proliferate and recede into the distance. These girls might be her descendants, not the children of her lovers and rapists here in the Cape, but perhaps those of her sisters who evaded the slave catchers. My search for Scylla takes me to Ilha de Mozambique. It is from there that Scylla most likely left her native country. When the vehicle leaves the African mainland, it moves above the water. My belly lurches, and then the vehicle enters Ilha de Mozambique, a coral landmass rooted in the Indian Ocean. In the morning, the island is shrouded in a white mist. The mainland is invisible, and we are adrift on the corals, unmoored from the world. The other island, Robben Island, where Scylla served a life sentence at the bottom of the continent, was bitterly cold for her. Here on Ilha, her wait for the ship would have been much warmer. Perhaps it was cloying hot if she was pressed against other captured people, awaiting Portuguese slave ships. Both islands served as a prison. With blurred vision, I recognize that fog shrouds horrors. For Scylla, the fog might have been terrorizing, or it may have offered a reprieve from the watching eyes of her enslavers. At Ilha, my search takes me to the slave warehouses still standing on the water's edge centuries later. I slept in the slave warehouses because they're now boutique hotels. In my nose, Scylla is like an ancient coral. However, besides traces in the scent that intermingles with the mangroves wafted, here among the old warehouses where she might have been readied for the ships, I find neither Scylla nor her mother. They have vanished into the fog. Perhaps they hunt for fish or bathe in the ocean. After the mid-lift, I might see them dyed in the turquoise tones of the island waters. Something like Tracy Guy in the image here. Gums points me to kindred beyond taxonomy. In search of her own ancestors, she observes, and I sought to understand the species of whales, coral, barnacles, bacteria, and so forth that were speaking from the bottom of the surface of the ocean. I began to understand that the scientific taxonomy of what constitutes a species or which family, phyla, genus, in some cases even kingdom and domain, a particular form of life was as debatable and discursively unstable as the narratives within my family. Searching for Scylla requires that I look among the corals, mangroves in the sea, sand, in the blackness of the undertow, beyond the taxonomies of place and species as we have come to know them. This is an aquatic, interspecies listening that folds temporality and transports us to planetary imaginaries. Gums provocatively asks, or her provocation asks, what if you could breathe like coral from a multitude of simultaneous openings connected to one source built upon the bones of all your dead? I submerge my head in the Indian Ocean and in the buzz that plays in my ears, Scylla converses with her mother in squelchy tongue. They use their ancestors' bones to breed like coral. On the dhow that takes me between islands of this archipelago, the young man points to a humpback whale whose majestic form moves the water. I imagine that I see, or I do see, Scylla's Barrow, her son, sitting on the whale head. In this scene, unlike Aisha's boat in the Kenyan novel House of Rust, the whale is enfleshed. There are many other children in the form of barnacles on the vast back. They chatter in a low buzz, like wind blowing through shells, conches, and corals. On the tail towards the end are Zintle Maditla's children, her 4 children. This is the woman who in Mpumalanga of 2018 killed her 4 children. Fat cherubs with black glowing cheeks and white tendrils down their heads. Beloved is there too. Do you know Beloved? But she is young and ungrown and suckles on seaweed while clutching blue starfish. She does not move to the rhythm of spite, as in the novel Beloved. With her is Margaret Garland's little Mary. Like sandpaper, the water has removed the palm lines of the children of Felicide. Perhaps Scylla has changed from coral to bone to whale to carry this load of children once dead and now pulsing with endless life. Scylla steers the well like a fleet of free people aboard the Black Star Line of the Universal Negro Association of Marcus Garvey. Or maybe, like the other god, she has a queer omnipresence. The whale goes under, and the suction is filled by black sparkling water that sways the small wooden vessel to which I am tethered. In the monsoon winds blowing from the Indian subcontinent, I intuit Scylla's mother weeping. Sometimes it knocks over large baobabs, this wind, but mostly it is a relentless buzz raging against the hardy warehouses where her daughter was once captured. A sonic breaking of hearts. In the island buzz, like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez character, I'm overtaken by the terrible desire to weep. In the shadows, Scylla and her mother flit in and out of view. I cannot find Scylla. My task was always futile. All we are left with are traces, but read together, traces, artwork, give us form and fill out the ghostly narrative of forced deracination. Scylla was always more than her enslavement, multiple rapes and filicide. Because she had another name and a mother who could lift the earth's carpet and hide in the coral reef, she was always more than Scylla. To listen to the unrelenting wind in the drafty hut on Robben Island requires us to return to Ilha de Mozambique and attend to the shadows of the Makuti under the earth's surface. Scylla does not respond when I call her name. It echoes through the basin settlement of the island, and the young girls look blankly at me. Before she left the island, she acknowledged another name. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Hugo. So I'll offer a few reflections, and then I will join Hugo for a small question and answer, and then I'll open it up for everyone. Thank you so much, Hugo, for that again. So open and deep considerations over the artworks in the exhibition. I wasn't sure where to start. What do I prioritize, realizing that I only have a short time to respond? I thought perhaps the best place to start is right at the beginning. Hugo, you reference Van Doren, Kirksey, and Munster in speaking to entanglements, arts of attentiveness in how knowing and living are deeply entangled, and that paying attention can and should be the basis for crafting better possibilities for a shared life. I appreciate this formulation. It made me think of another beginning, my own beginnings at the CHR. One of the reasons I joined the CHR was a question at the heart of the CHR project, or perhaps one of the important questions. It said, I quote, "How," it might be asked, "might the quest for better ways of living in the aftermath of colonialism and apartheid be facilitated through humanities inquiry?" Close quote. This is a question I am now asking about my own work as I journey through this space, because I find it useful and incredibly generative question. I think part of the answer to this question lies in what Van Doren, Kirksey, Munster articulate on paying attention can and should be the basis for crafting better possibilities for shared life. I want to pause here on the idea of possibilities of a shared life, because it sits with CHR's quest for better ways of living in the aftermath of colonialism and apartheid. These, for me, all point towards an idea of a livable life. A livable life remains elusive for many in post-colonial Africa, indeed post-apartheid South Africa, as demonstrated in your book, Hugo, Riotous Deathscapes. In your emotionally and beautifully charged writing, a livable life seems to evade many in this aftermath. And almost childlike, by that I mean perhaps naive, I want to think of the idea of a livable life. By livable life, I'm thinking alongside Nussbaum's idea of capabilities and fundamental entitlements. Capabilities are about freedom to be alive, freedom to pursue one's dreams and to live a full life without violence. Nussbaum's articulations on life and bodily integrity, amongst other capabilities, are crucial in ensuring not just human rights, but human capabilities. Nussbaum argues that life is being able to live to the end of life, of normal length, not dying prematurely or before one's life is so reduced as to be not worth living. Furthermore, she argues that bodily integrity is being able to move freely from place to place, to be secure against violent assault, including sexual assault and domestic violence, and having opportunities for, yes, sexual satisfaction and for choice in matters of reproduction. As you opened your talk today with the idea of entanglements, that we live entangled lives that make and unmake us. Here too, I want to pause a little and think of the ways our current politics, whether through the red ants or politicians desiring to garner favor, or the layperson looking for someone to blame for their wars, they all seek to make simple the complicated ways in which we are entangled. Even as we try to untangle ourselves in violent forgetting through Afrophobic attacks on people from other parts of our continent, in the misguided desire that our freedom and success, in other words, the possibility of a livable life, lies in their removal. Here, South Africans are short-sighted and suffer from amnesia on the limits of citizenship. As it was not long ago when Black, colored, and Indian South Africans were only partial citizens of this country, if that. We might want to heed the words of Ariella Azule's articulations that, and I quote, "Citizenship is carceral. It jails us to imperial logic. Through it, we are constantly being used by global imperial regimes." In speaking of entanglements, Hugo, of course, I'm pressed to evoke Sarah Nuttall's considered writings on entanglement, where she argues entanglement is a condition of being twisted together or entwined, involved with. It speaks of an intimacy gained even if it was resisted or ignored or even uninvited. It is a term which may gesture towards a relationship or set of social relationships that is complicated, ensnaring, in a large tangle, but which also implies a human foldedness. It works with difference and sameness, but also with their limits, their predicaments, and their moments of complication. So even as we try to untangle ourselves in violent forgetting, we are reminded by the artworks in this exhibition, Jody Brand's work in particular, and by your reiteration, Hugo, of our entanglements with, I know academics don't like repetition, but I insist on repetition, Van Mozambique, Azio of Madagascar, Snap of Batavia, of Madagascar, Syricus of Mauritius, Dam of Bengal, Peter of Madagascar, January of Mozambique, Sable of Madagascar. Entangled, entwined, knotted. Here then, today, Hugo, you are calling us to look, to see, to witness, very importantly, to remember our entanglements with others, but also with the natural world that makes livability possible. Hugo speaks about thinking with enchantment and opacity, arguing that these concepts destabilize the boundaries between humans, animals, plants, and the environments, but then goes further by adding gender and sexuality to the list of issues destabilized through enchantment and opacity. My second last riff-off. I want to riff off here, Hugo, and speak about queerness as a destabilizing force of normative categories of gender and sexuality. You are correct in pointing out that we are fixed and enclosed in racial capitalist logics and modernist enclosures of gender and sexuality. But queerness creates paths of escape, creating a fugitivity towards opacity, to use your lexicon. Today you ask us, and I love this question, as queer, why come out of the closet when there is water? To emerge, submerge, and remake oneself in ways that embrace errantry and opacity. Here I see you engaging a politics of refusal. Particularly, you are refusing the epistemology of the closet. In line with Michel Foucault, you are skeptical of the confessional ethos, because, as Foucault put it, and I quote, Western man is a confessional man. The confessional is related to self-examining to get to some kind of truth. But of course, the confession is related to power. As Evenhays put it, I quote, the role of confessions is created by power to maintain power. What I hear in your deliberations today is that even this in and out of the closet mimics a particular understanding of sexuality hinged on ideas of the binary. With this, I see you thinking along Joseph Massad, who wrote the really incredible book, Desiring Arabs, where he critiques the very binary construction of homosexual, heterosexual, as a frame that is unable to hold pre-colonial knowledges of same-sex desire, because that very binarism is not part of non-Western ontological structures. In an LGBTQI plus world that is increasingly inclusive, as you mentioned, in some aspects at least, but also regulatory in that very inclusion, you are correct that queer opacity allows to consider the generativity of not knowing. Here then, maybe we want to ask, what is it to be queer? Warner describes queerness as a thorough resistance of the regimes of the normal. That queer protests not just the normal behavior, but the social idea of the normal behavior. Here then we must ask critical questions about the methodologies that create the normal. Halperin sees queerness, perhaps in line with our exhibition, as much more fluid, an identity without an essence, not a given condition, but a horizon of possibility. Often, LGBTQI plus identities and lives are articulated through discourses of loss, loneliness, and social work issues. What is often missing is the ways that queerness revitalizes, that it is an ideality, to use the words of Jose Munoz. In fact, he would argue that we are not yet queer, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. Queerness here then forces us to ask questions about what we know or what we think we know. Queerness asks, how do you know what you know? In the catalog, I write about gender fluidity. In other words, the trans movement, how it forces us to think expansively about gender, understanding gender identity as shifting or as existing outside normative orders. In this sense, people with a gender fluid lived experience or trans identity, their reality mirrors the hydrological cycle, evaporating, condensing, flowing, pulling, freezing, in a continuous dance of transformation. This resonance creates an affinity with the natural systems that reject rigidity. A gender fluid perspective, perhaps one would say a trans perspective, therefore can inform a more nuanced understanding of ecological relationships, ones that value dynamism, interdependence, and change over the ideas of control and dominance. The transgender movement and its demand for a more complex understanding of gender configurations in the world propels us all to think greater about gender equality in general. Here then, the articulations of Christina Sharp in her marvelous book, In the Wake, of seeing trans with an asterisk, provides an opening, and I see it as incredibly instructive. I promise I'm coming to a close. I quote, I want to think trans in a variety of ways that try to get at something about or towards the reigns of trans formations enacted on and by Black bodies. The asterisk after the word functions as the wild card, and I'm thinking the trans, well, asterisk, in that way. The asterisk after the prefix trans holds the place open for thinking from and into that position. It speaks as well to a range of embodied experiences called gender and Euro-Western gender's dismantling, its inability to hold on and in Black flesh. The asterisk speaks to a range of configurations of Black being that take the form of translation, transatlantic, transgression, transgender, transformation, transmogrification, transcontinental, transfixed, transmediterranean, transubstantiation, transmigration, and many, many more. Here, Sharp opens up new possibilities of thinking about the prefix trans, particularly as we think about Black bodies. But of course, she goes further to include other trans articulations, challenging us to move beyond and think of the variety of ways that the prefix trans functions as a wild card. The question then becomes, what are the possibilities of using this wild card in our contexts, in our scholarship? What happens when we operationalize the prefix trans? As I move towards Q&A with Hugo, I would like to refer to Hugo's own articulations on being queerly African from this book. In the book Riotous Deathscapes, Hugo, I want to read from here quickly. And again, I read you as writing about refusal. This is, to be queerly African is to fail at being a self-contained and actualized modern subject. It is to be in relation to multiple others, to eschew the linearity of settler time, and to refuse social formations that are made for men. To live queerly is to stay in struggle without seeking escape and transcendence. Close quote. Here we might want to think about the possibilities availed to us through failure. That is, failure to embody the normative, failure to embody the dominant, and ultimately failure to be oppressive. What happens when there is an embrace of failure? Queer failure is a useful tool to think with in a world dominated by ideas and ideals of heteronormative success. The idea of queer failure was popularized by Jack Halberstam in the book, The Queer Art of Failure. Other scholars and artists have picked up the idea of failure, and one of the most recent artists to use the concept is queer artist Ocean Vuong, who wrote the amazing debut novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. While promoting the book, Vuong spoke about queer failure, about how queer people grow up in a world with no signposts, and so as they begin to make their way in the world, they must learn how to be through a series of failures. Here then, failure becomes a way of being in the world. It becomes a teacher, a way to chart your own path in the world. It becomes an opportunity to discover. In this then, queer people fail forward, creating, forging, growing, becoming. Halberstam's idea of queer failure praises those that are anti-normative, anti-capitalist, anti-disciplinary. Here then, queer people, gender non-conforming people, trans people, are all anti-normative and anti-disciplinary, and looking for other ways to be in the world. As Elias has noted, Halberstam collects a set of narratives that weave together a politics of solidarity, of refusal, of unbecoming and unknowing, of the absurd that all come back to failing differently, failing better, and failing collectively. In a way, then, failure becomes a way to succeed, because if you fail to uphold dominant forms of masculinity, of being, forms that valorize patriarchy, whiteness, forms that are violent to other beings for being different, I think then perhaps that's a way to win. Thank you. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for being here. Clearly from my response, there are quite a number of thoughts from what you said that come to me, but perhaps I want to ask you about the last thing you spoke about, Sila, and I think also Primesh in his talk spoke a little bit about hauntings and hauntology, your quest to put together this life, to find out more. So I'm interested in the question of the ghost, ghosts that haunts us and as the living, as it were. So that's the one thing, which is linked to my second thing, which I think is a literary question, maybe, or maybe not, I don't know. But it's something about the literary, in thinking about writing about Sila for you, because you reference Christian's novel Unconfessed, right? And of course, you also reference Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? Margaret Garner's story. And so my question is about the work that the literary does, right? In engaging scholarship, in thinking about piecing together fragments from archives that are partly missing, partly not there, partly non-existent, right? From the shards of history. Yeah. And to say I myself have been interested in the literary, but in a very different sort. I'm interested in it vis-a-vis in thinking about queerness, but also the city, and particularly interested in the work of Seloke Dacre, The Quiet Violence of Dreams. But so it's a bit of a selfish question, but I think it's a good one.
Thanks very much for that, Lwando, and for your really considered and deep engagement with my contribution. So the literary, I don't disclose in public Kopano's discipline to which I am tangentially tethered, no, unmoored. But I do disclose the fact that one of my majors was literature, and I live in regret for never pursuing it fully. But what the literary does give us, I think those trained in social science traditions, is permission to be playful, but also to apprehend beauty, right, in ways that is often evaded by the lawyers and the people whose disciplines attend to the problem, to the trauma, to deepening, to digging at the wound in order to excise the poison. And as a method, allow us to do the kinds of things that sociology might frown on, because they give, so it's a license. But I try not to stop at literature. So for this particular project, Jaco Boshoff and colleagues who work at the Izigo Museum, who dive into the ocean to excavate shipwrecks, right, and other materials from the ocean, give us another form of accessing that which we who walk on the surface are unable to access. So how do we lean on all of these resources that we have, but that our disciplines have trained us are not our realm of expertise, and therefore, the blunting of knowledge, the kind of modernist disciplines. So the literary, and some of my best friends are literary scholars. So Seloke Dacre and the city. I think that way of what others oceanic scholars call a penguin view of the world, right? Whether it's Azuri in 13 cents, a teenage boy, preteen or so, wandering Sea Point and the street. So what do we see when we lower our gaze, right? And what does a marginal queer subject of the city observe? So I'm much more interested in the rural myself, because anyone who bothers to listen to me will know I'm from the Sigi, and so rural landscapes are important to me. But I can see how scholars or writers like Seloke Dacre give us another view of the city that urban planners and architects give us alternative angles.
Thank you. Yes, I think so too. So, I had a thing about methodology, because I think it was really interesting how you spoke about walking the streets, following Sylvia Hartman, the slave lodges that become, places, hotel lodges. But I think I'm going to park that question because you mentioned methodology a little bit. And I'm going to ask my last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. And my other question is about death. Alok, who was here in Cape Town earlier this year, spoke very passionately about death, arguing that death is not the elephant in the room, it is the room. When one thinks of water, death follows in terms of thought processes, at least for me. When one thinks of water, death is there, you know, SS Mendi, right? Shipwrecks off of the coast of South African waters. And of course, death is complicated, right? But death is not the end also, right? There are continuities, spirits, ghosts, legacies, the tombs, shipwrecks are interacting with the living in incredibly profound ways. And also when you spoke about Jodie Brand's Pickle series, right? You described it as a history that refuses to be disappeared. Again, right, slave ships, right, drowned off of the coast of South Africa, including Clifton, which you spoke about last time. And so I want you to speak a bit on this.
So death is like a deep interest of mine, and I guess it's an attempt in some ways to domesticate death, because death, of course, is coming for all of us. If we haven't encountered it at close hand, we will shortly, because that's the nature of the world. And for some, right, death is ever present. Many of those are not in this room because there's a particular kind of selection that happens. And so into people's daily lives, rituals and rhythms, death is closely, is kind of ever present, living with the ghosts. So in some ways, it's a form of enlivening death, right, rather than surrendering to the sense of finality, but that it's always there. And water does interesting things, because in water, of course, is life and death simultaneously, and these two things cleave together and rebuild on each other. So there's like accretions with the live species take from the dead in order to sustain their own life, as capitalism does too. So this project is particularly interested in water, but what I take away from water often is that its very movement and agency, it's like its activity is alive. So it complicates death in ways that I think the land often doesn't do as evocatively as that. I was in Soweto last week because I work there, and someone asked me, because we're talking about Abantu Bamans, so people from the Eastern Cape, largely because of its coastal location, will know that they are people of the water, right? And this person was asking, because people of the water are said to live underwater for maybe up to 3 years, or weeks at a time, and this person asked, so between us now, is it real? Of course, there's no straightforward answer to it. It's real for those who believe that people live underwater, and it's a way of it's a sociality with water that coastal people have, that form our idioms and expressions and ways of thinking about death and life in complicated ways.
Okay. I will stop with my questions and I will open it up to the floor if other people have interventions for Hugo.
Hugo, both to you and Lwando, I'm interested in this thing of life and death sitting right next to each other, and it being brought in with water. And I'm going to give you a quick example. So I come from Kimberley. It's big hole, it's celebrated, and yet for me, it is one of the most depressing sites that are around that you have to pass, and it's actually now in the center of the city. So you can't get anywhere without literally passing this gaping hole that's now got green water in it. And growing up, we knew that people committed suicide. But the story that my grandmother told me is that it's because, I don't know what the word is because it's a Kimberley word, and it's probably not a proper Afrikaans word. Watermeisie. What is that in mermaid? Yes. So that there were mermaids that live in, and they called souls in order for them to live into this water. And that's why people would commit suicide. And obviously, as a kid, we were all afraid of the big hole because of that. But when you grow up and you read history and you realize that there are stories of miners, black miners, who, they had to just carry on digging, and you leave the body they die in there and they just carry on. But what I found out later is that though when white miners or employees of De Beers died during the digging up of this hole, they would actually be lifted out. So the effort to lift that body out would be followed through. So I'm interested now in, this is a living death, this hole in itself, and also the people who have died in it, but the people who live around it. How do we then negate life when that death is life? That hole is a death and it is life.
People in Soweto, interestingly, often have similar stories to tell because of all the mine dumps there. A friend of mine, Grace Kunu, was talking about people's water stories in Soweto. And she says all the male people in her family have stories of going to look for the mermaid, the Watermeisie. In the river, I think it's a Klip River. Now what we know about the Klip River, it's extremely polluted. The latest headlines is that it's full of ARVs. But that people search for water even in deathscapes, because they're also searching for life and for pleasure, right? In these places that are also enclosures for death making, and convert them in their small ways to be, and sometimes those small ways are deadly, but in search of pleasure, right? And in mining landscapes in particular, with death zones, for the reasons that you've just told us with that example of miners' bodies that kind of sediment the bottoms of the great hole that we take pictures of. These are racialized zones, they gendered zones, they all of the isms that we know, and they all are complicated places. And the last point I'll say is that so that example and the example I'm giving of Soweto, we often think of water. We have to come to Cape Town to think deeply about water. But people are thinking deeply and practicing water, in all kinds of ways, even in places where the water may not be.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about the dominance of the coast and how people think about water. But actually, I mean, I understand your question was about water, but what struck me actually in your question is suicide, and and suicide in South Africa, young people, the Eastern Cape, in the in the long while, has been almost chronic, really, particularly men. And this is that's kind of what came to my mind actually when you said suicide, and perhaps our non-attending to that to some extent, and in thinking seriously about the lives of black young people and who decide to take their lives.
Thank you for that exceptional presentation, Antilwando. I wanted to ask about anecdote and what the status is of anecdote. And I was thinking a little bit as you were speaking about a wonderful essay by Susie Newton-King, who was in the history department at UWC, who wrote a piece called Hilary Smith and the Shadow of Death, where she is also much earlier than Saadia Hartman trying to figure out what a narrative interlocutor might be in an archive that is filled with gaps and where you're minding gaps all over the place. But it does seem to me that the anecdote falls short of being conscripted to the realms of knowledge. For example, there's ways in which anecdote don't make the cut of what one constitutes as knowledge. And I suspect that elite anecdotes become knowledge, but not subaltern anecdotes. And so I was wondering if you could just think a little bit about, what does anecdote do for us in thinking about, the fluidities that we want to invoke in the metaphoricity of water.
I work a lot with anecdote, and I might not think of it like conceptually, but as knowledge, because in this book, Riotous Deathscapes, I write at length, I think it might be chapter 3, about this conversation between young boys talking about, this is a classroom scene, the appearance of a snake, which then turns into a pig, then turns into Igwinya. And I give a translation and say fat cake, and then Pumla Gola was like, don't call it a fat cake, Igwinya. But as of course, as you've said, as knowledge, right? But in doing that, taking that seriously as forms of knowledge, which might be forms, thought as forms of theory. I mean, the risk, of course, even as I say this, is by leaning on that and then talking about in a text where I'm attempting to theorize with these young boys, because of course that smacks of like elevating anecdote into forms of theory, but that people are seized with this every day. This is how they make the world. This is how they tell their lives, and yet it's in the disciplines. It's considered story, right? Lesser, but to know the ocean, I think, in South Africa that has this long coastline, I think anecdote is probably the most present form of knowledge that articulates this knowledge of the ocean. And if we surrender to global west, global north kind of theory, as belated, what Kigurumacharya called belatedness, right? That we're forever trying to catch up, because to do theory, you have to articulate it this way. We lose sight then of the proliferation of theory on this coast about water, and will forever be belated, right? Because we're mimicking how you theorize, and we have to go through. I don't even know these theorists because my training lacks. But you have to go through someone big. Who's someone big to make a point? Spivak is a nice pig. We like her. Okay. Oh, we don't. So
Can't.
yes, that says it. So yeah, you have to go through Freud, who's actually writing, and Piaget, who are writing about anecdote. My child did this, therefore, it is the great unconscious, right? When everyone has children, it's actually quite unexceptional. So, to make points that we know.
I really, really enjoyed, I think the abstract quality of writing and speaking about this also, and in metaphor, because it also really speaks to the way that water is. And so what I was finding a lot in these abstractions and these anecdotes and these stories also about water was really grounding me in pleasure. I think, yeah, I'm really interested in how pleasure plays a role, and keyword play, also pleasure and play in this role of fugitivity in this extractive empire. And that role of the abstraction of water, but also the poetics of pleasure. When we think of pleasure, also that's a key role in the siren enchantment. I think the role of pleasure, I think when I'm thinking about outside of queering being transgressive, but also queering in its play and also in its pleasure. So how can we speak to, I think, the poetics of pleasure within fugitivity and also evading capitalism and capitalist affairs?
South Africans and dance, right? Not just South Africans, Africans, like in Ghana, the coffin bearing people during COVID dancing. And this dance, right, is at its most frenzied at funerals, right? And which is about mourning, but it's also about play, pleasure, relation, being in communion, in contact, rubbing. So I think about, in this work, I'm in Mombasa, that Huda writes about, and at a mangrove, right? This mangrove is not too far from Fort Jesus, which is a fort, obviously, that enslaved people were kept in before they would be taken through the Persian Gulf and the islands on the Indian Ocean. And the mangrove is a chilling place on Sundays of fish fries, barbecues, and dance and Tusker beer and children riding horses, and really like a sociality that defies what that place might have been, or in other ways enlivens this place where people might have run to, mangroves, to escape, to hide below the low-hanging trees, in the water, because pleasure and pain which is so pervasive on this continent, right? This continent where genocides were practiced before being unleashed elsewhere, where there's current genocides or large death making, is always happening at the same time as people are pleasuring, right, enjoying themselves. And I think that's the ultimate middle finger to warmongers, to genocidaires, to extractors, is that despite that, we're still laughing and having a really good time. And not to lose sight of that. Thank you.
Yeah. We're moving to the close now, but maybe also to say the space we're in, right? Iyatsiba Lab. Iyatsiba is to jump, right? In vernacular. So you can think about play in jumping. You can think about, every time I think about jumping, actually, I think about rope. right? Jump rope, which one plays when one was young. And so, I mean, I think even considering the exhibition, right? And I mean, we had all kinds of conversations with Rory and Tammy about fun and the intellectual properties of fun. Thank you so much, Hugo. This was really, really amazing. You were great.